Crete's isolation was never complete. It was defined by the sea that surrounded it. From the earliest stages of human occupation, the island's position in the eastern Mediterranean shaped how communities formed, interacted, and sustained themselves over millennia. Crete lies at the southern edge of the Aegean Sea, extending nearly 260 kilometers east to west, with a narrow landmass divided by rugged mountain ranges. The White Mountains in the west, Mount Ida in the center, and the Dictys Range in the east dominate the island's interior, limiting large-scale inland agriculture while encouraging settlement along the coastal plains. Archaeological surveys indicate that early communities favored lowland areas with access to arable soil, freshwater springs, and maritime routes. Sites such as Knossos, Phaistos, and coastal locations in eastern Crete demonstrate long-term continuity of occupation shaped by these environmental constraints. The island's climate during the Holocene, particularly between c. 700 and 3000 BCE, remained relatively stable, characterized by mild winters and dry summers typical of the Mediterranean basin. Paleo-environmental data derived from pollen analysis and sediment cores indicate conditions favorable for the cultivation of cereals, olives, and grapes. This climatic consistency supported gradual population growth and agricultural expansion, reducing dependence on seasonal mobility and enabling permanent settlement patterns to emerge. Crete's surrounding seas functioned as connective corridors rather than barriers. The Aegean provided access to mainland Greece, the Cycladic Islands, Anatolia, and, through longer routes, Egypt and the Levant. Obsidian sourcing studies demonstrate early maritime exchange, particularly with Melos, beginning in the Neolithic period. These findings indicate that seafaring technologies and navigational knowledge developed early, integrating Crete into wider exchange networks long before the emergence of complex political structures. Despite this connectivity, Crete maintained a degree of insulation from large-scale population movements affecting the mainland. The absence of major river systems limited overland communication across the island, reinforcing regionalism while preserving cultural continuity. This balance between isolation and access contributed to the gradual development of distinctive material traditions visible in ceramics, architecture, and settlement organization. Geography also influenced subsistence strategies. Limited grazing land and fragmented arable zones encouraged mixed economies combining agriculture, animal husbandry, and maritime resources. Coastal exploitation of fish and shellfish is attested at multiple sites, reinforcing the importance of the sea in daily life. Over time, these environmental conditions oriented Cretan communities toward maritime interaction as a structural necessity rather than a secondary activity. As environmental stability continued into the late Neolithic and early Bronze Age, the physical landscape of Crete provided both the constraints and opportunities necessary for sustained human occupation. By the end of this period, the island's geography had already shaped settlement distribution, economic priorities, and long-distance connectivity, forming the foundation upon which later Minoan society would develop. As environmental conditions stabilized, permanent human settlement became increasingly viable across key regions of the island. Before we continue, you may consider subscribing to the channel and enabling notifications to receive future Nightfall history documentaries. New episodes are released regularly, exploring ancient civilizations through evidence-based, chronological analysis. If you find a particular section especially compelling, feel free to note it in the comments below. Long before palaces, Crete was already connected to the wider Aegean world. Archaeological evidence indicates that Crete was first permanently settled during the early Neolithic period, around 7000 BCE. The earliest well-documented site is Knossos, where deep stratigraphic layers reveal continuous occupation spanning several millennia. These early communities practiced mixed farming, cultivating domesticated wheat and barley while raising sheep and goats. Grinding stones, sickle blades, and storage pits attest to organized food production and long-term planning rather than seasonal habitation. Ceramic assemblages from Neolithic levels at Knossos show gradual technological refinement, with increasingly standardized vessel forms used for storage, cooking, and transport. Stone tools remained prevalent, though obsidian blades sourced from the island of Melos appear consistently across Cretan sites. Geochemical analysis confirms that this obsidian was imported, providing clear evidence of early maritime exchange networks operating across the Aegean Sea. These findings demonstrate that seafaring and inter-island contact were integral to Cretan life from the earliest periods of settlement. Beyond Knossos, Neolithic activity is attested at sites such as Gerani Cave in western Crete and coastal settlements identified through surface surveys. Cave sites often preserve evidence of ritual use alongside habitation, including animal bones and ceramics deposited over extended periods. Settlement patterns suggest small, dispersed communities rather than large population centers, reflecting adaptation to Crete's fragmented agricultural landscape. Burial practices from this period are relatively simple and show limited differentiation, with no clear indicators of inherited status or centralized authority. This absence of pronounced hierarchy suggests that Neolithic Cretan society was largely egalitarian, organized around kinship groups and local cooperation. However, the long-term continuity of settlements indicates increasing social coordination, particularly in land use, food storage, and craft production. Archaeologists note that the Neolithic period established key demographic and technological foundations for later development. Population growth, sustained agriculture, and maritime connectivity created conditions favorable for increased complexity. Although political institutions had not yet emerged, the organizational capacities required for them were already present in embryonic form. Gradual population growth and technological refinement prepared the ground for societal transformation during the early Bronze Age. By the 3rd millennium BCE, Cretan society was beginning to change irreversibly. During the late Neolithic and into the early Bronze Age, roughly between 3200 and 2600 BCE, archaeological evidence indicates a gradual but significant transformation in the organization of Cretan communities. Settlement patterns expanded in both size and number, with increased continuity suggesting demographic growth. Sites such as Knossos and Phaistos show architectural modifications, including more substantial dwellings and the emergence of communal storage facilities, pointing to evolving systems of resource management. Material culture from this period reflects growing craft specialization. Pottery production became more standardized, with regional styles developing alongside improved firing techniques. Metallurgical evidence, particularly copper tools and ornaments, appears with increasing frequency, indicating technological innovation and access to imported raw materials. Since Crete lacks native copper sources, the presence of metal artifacts confirms participation in long-distance exchange networks extending to the Cyclades and Anatolia. Burial practices also began to diversify. Collective tombs, tholos structures, and varied grave goods appear in several regions, marking a departure from earlier uniform interments. These differences suggest emerging social distinctions based on wealth, occupation, or lineage. Although no centralized political authority can yet be identified, such differentiation indicates shifting social relationships and the gradual formation of hierarchical structures. Trade networks expanded in scale and complexity during this transitional phase. Obsidian, metals, and crafted goods moved between Crete and neighboring regions, reinforcing maritime connectivity. Archaeological distributions of early Bronze Age ceramics demonstrate increasing interregional interaction within the Aegean. These exchanges supported economic growth while exposing Cretan communities to new technologies and organizational models. Despite these changes, evidence for institutional governance remains limited. Authority appears to have been local and decentralized, exercised through kin-based leadership rather than formal administration. Nevertheless, the cumulative effects of population growth, technological advancement, and expanding trade networks created conditions conducive to more complex forms of organization. By the end of the early Bronze Age, Cretan society had moved beyond purely village-based systems. Economic integration, social differentiation, and maritime exchange laid the structural foundations for the emergence of palatial institutions in the centuries that followed. These early transformations culminated in the emergence of organized political centers during the Proto-Palatial period. The early Minoan period marks Crete's first clearly identifiable civilization. The early Minoan period, spanning approximately 3100 to 2100 BCE, represents the transition from the final Neolithic communities into more complex and regionally distinct societies. Archaeological evidence indicates a widespread expansion of settlements, both in coastal plains and in more sheltered inland locations. Excavations at Knossos, Phaistos, and other central sites reveal densely clustered structures with multiple rooms, often arranged around shared courtyards. These architectural patterns suggest the development of permanent village complexes capable of supporting larger populations than those of the preceding Neolithic era. Material culture provides one of the clearest indicators of early Minoan identity. Pottery styles, in particular, demonstrate chronological progression and regional variation. Early Minoan ceramics are generally simple, undecorated wares, while early Minoan II introduces incised geometric designs and the use of red and black slip. By early Minoan III, more elaborate vessel forms appear, including conical cups and patterned storage jars. The distribution of these ceramics across multiple sites indicates not only local production but also extensive interregional exchange, suggesting an island-wide cultural cohesion despite the emergence of localized styles. Technological innovation is also evident during this period. Metallurgy, primarily in copper, appears with increasing regularity. Tools, ornaments, and small ceremonial objects attest to both functional and symbolic use. Since Crete lacks large indigenous copper deposits, archaeologists infer that raw material was imported from nearby islands or mainland sources, further reflecting early Minoan engagement with broader Aegean networks. Stone tool production continues alongside these developments, showing continuity with Neolithic methods while integrating new techniques for precision and efficiency. External contact intensified during this era. Archaeological finds, including Cycladic figurines and Near Eastern-inspired motifs on pottery, indicate both direct and indirect interactions with neighboring regions. These contacts introduced new artistic conventions, religious iconography, and technological knowledge, which were adapted to local practices. Such influences highlight the Minoans' capacity to integrate foreign elements into an emerging and coherent cultural identity. Settlement expansion is accompanied by subtle signs of social differentiation. While explicit hierarchies are not clearly documented, variations in house size, burial treatment, and access to imported goods suggest the beginnings of differentiated status. Certain communities, particularly larger central settlements, appear to have acted as focal points for craft specialization, storage, and trade, signaling nascent organizational structures. Yet, authority remains localized, and political centralization is not yet evident. The early Minoan period also shows growing adaptation to maritime resources. Fishing implements, small harbors, and imported obsidian indicate that even at this stage, seafaring was central to economic life. Island-wide interaction and external contacts created pressure for more coordinated forms of organization, foreshadowing the emergence of palatial centers in the subsequent proto-palatial period. By the end of this period, Crete had developed a recognizable cultural and technological profile. Settlements were larger and more complex than in the Neolithic. Pottery and metallurgy demonstrated technical and artistic sophistication, and the island had become integrated into wider Aegean exchange networks. These developments collectively established the foundation upon which institutional and administrative structures would emerge in later Minoan society. Growing interaction across the island and with neighboring regions required new forms of social organization and leadership, setting the stage for the construction of the first palaces in the proto-palatial period. Specialization transformed production and social relationships. Archaeological evidence from the early Minoan period indicates a growing differentiation in labor and social organization. Excavations of burial sites reveal variations in grave goods, suggesting emerging inequality. Some tombs contained imported materials, copper tools, or elaborately decorated pottery, while others retained minimal offerings. These differences imply that certain individuals or families held greater economic or social influence within their communities. Craft specialization also became increasingly prominent. Workshops excavated at sites such as Knossos and Vasiliki contain evidence of organized production, particularly in ceramics and metallurgy. Copper artifacts, including tools and ornaments, point to the presence of dedicated metalworking centers. The spatial clustering of production spaces suggests that labor was coordinated, with specific groups responsible for particular tasks, rather than being uniformly distributed across households. Administrative control is implied by the presence of seal stones and standardized storage containers. Though no written records survive from this phase, the repeated patterns in artifact distribution indicate systematic management of resources, likely overseen by local leaders or councils. This early form of bureaucratic oversight reflects the gradual emergence of centralized authority, necessary to coordinate specialized production and manage surplus goods. Together, these developments demonstrate a significant shift in early Minoan society. Social hierarchies began to form alongside technological and economic innovation, laying the groundwork for the more complex administrative structures of the Proto-Palatial period. Settlement layouts and craft organization reflect an increasingly interconnected society, capable of coordinating labor and controlling production at a scale beyond individual households. Administrative complexity soon demanded permanent institutional spaces, providing the foundation for the construction of the first Minoan palaces. Trade connected Crete long before palaces governed it. During the early Minoan period, Crete's communities became increasingly integrated into broader Aegean exchange networks. Archaeological evidence demonstrates that raw materials and finished goods moved regularly between the island and neighboring regions. Obsidian sourced from Melos is present at multiple early Minoan sites, including Knossos and Phaistos, confirming long-distance seafaring and early maritime logistics. The distribution of Cycladic figurines and stylistically influenced pottery further illustrates cultural and commercial interaction across the Aegean. Ceramic analysis reveals patterns consistent with inter-island trade. Certain early Minoan wares are found in both central and peripheral settlements, while imported ceramics and exotic raw materials appear in elite or craft specialist contexts. These distributions suggest a network of exchange that relied on both coastal navigation and island hopping strategies. Small harbor installations and maritime artifacts, such as boat-shaped weights and fishing equipment, provide additional evidence that seafaring was a core component of economic life. Crete's geographical position enabled it to act as an intermediary between mainland Greece, the Cyclades, and the eastern Mediterranean. The island's communities facilitated not only the movement of goods, but also the transfer of technological knowledge and stylistic motifs. Early Minoan artisans adapted imported techniques for local production, including metalworking and pottery decoration, which enhanced both functional and symbolic value. These developments highlight the importance of maritime integration prior to the rise of formal palatial centers. By linking production, craft specialization, and resource acquisition across multiple settlements, trade networks reinforced social differentiation and required coordination at a larger scale. Economic interconnection thus provided the structural basis for increasingly centralized administration and laid the groundwork for the complex political architecture of the Proto-Palatial period. Economic integration paved the way for centralized political architecture, culminating in the construction of Crete's first palaces. Around 1900 BCE, Crete reorganized itself around stone and authority. By the early Proto-Palatial period, major sites such as Knossos, Phaistos, and Malia saw the construction of the first palatial complexes. Excavations reveal multi-story buildings with intricate layouts, including courtyards, storage magazines, workshops, and ceremonial spaces. The architectural evidence indicates that these palaces were not primarily royal residences. Instead, they functioned as administrative and economic centers, coordinating production, redistribution, and social activity across surrounding settlements. Central to these complexes were large storage magazines, designed to hold agricultural surplus such as grain, olive oil, and wine. The presence of standardized pithoi or large storage jars, alongside weighing equipment and seal impressions, suggests a systematic approach to inventory and redistribution. Archaeologists infer that surplus goods were collected and managed centrally, then allocated according to social, economic, and ritual needs, reflecting a level of administrative coordination unseen in preceding early Minoan communities. The palaces also incorporated ceremonial spaces, including central courts and shrines, indicating that ritual and governance were intertwined. These features suggest that political authority in Proto-Palatial Crete was exercised through institutional structures rather than individual rulers. Artifacts such as clay ceilings, decorated pottery, and workshops indicate oversight of craft production and trade from within these complexes. The emergence of these administrative centers reflects the broader societal shift toward centralized organization. By concentrating resources, production, and ceremonial authority, the first palaces established the framework for complex governance, economic regulation, and social hierarchy on the island. Administration left its mark in clay, even if its words remain unread. The emergence of writing during the proto-palatial period reflects the increasing complexity of Minoan administration. Two distinct scripts are documented: Cretan hieroglyphic, appearing on large-format seal stones and clay tablets, and Linear A, used primarily for record-keeping on smaller tablets. Both systems are undeciphered, yet their context provides clear evidence of bureaucratic function. Archaeologists have identified recurring symbols associated with commodities, personnel, and place names, indicating organized accounting and institutional control. Excavations of palace archives at Knossos and Phaistos reveal thousands of clay tablets, many bearing impressions from seal stamps. These sealings were used to secure containers, track redistributed goods, and record transactions. Standardized markings suggest that multiple individuals were trained in the use of these scripts, indicating administrative specialization and hierarchical oversight. Linear A tablets often document quantities of grain, olive oil, and wine, reflecting the palace's role in resource management across the island. Cretan hieroglyphic appears on ceremonial objects and larger storage installations, suggesting a combination of ritual and economic documentation. Seal stones and impressed tablets indicate coordination between central palaces and subordinate sites. Despite the undeciphered nature of the scripts, their repeated patterns allow scholars to reconstruct aspects of Minoan bureaucratic practice and economic planning. These writing systems demonstrate that early Minoan governance had transitioned from informal coordination to formal institutional control. Administrative order was reinforced by standardized recording practices, enabling the palaces to monitor production, manage trade, and allocate resources efficiently. Administrative order was reinforced by shared religious practices, integrating ritual authority with economic and political structures. Belief systems structured political authority as much as stone walls did. During the early proto-palatial period, religious practices in Crete became increasingly integrated with emerging administrative structures. Peak sanctuaries on mountaintops, cave shrines such as those at Psychro and Kamars, and ceremonial spaces within palace complexes all indicate a formalization of ritual activity. Archaeologists have uncovered votive figurines, libation vessels, and offering tables, suggesting that religious observance was both public and institutionally endorsed. Palace-based rituals appear to have linked political authority with spiritual legitimacy. Central courts and shrines within Knossos and Phaistos demonstrate that ceremonial spaces were deliberately incorporated into administrative architecture. Clay figurines depicting female figures, possibly priestesses or deities associated with fertility, frequently appear alongside objects related to storage and distribution, indicating that ritual practice was entwined with economic oversight. Cave and peak sanctuaries, often located at sites distant from settlements, reveal continuity with earlier Neolithic and final Neolithic traditions. Offerings of pottery, animal bones, and small figurines in these locations indicate that religious customs persisted, even as centralized political structures emerged. Such continuity suggests that belief systems were adapted to support the authority of palace elites, reinforcing social cohesion and legitimizing institutional control. Material evidence shows that ritual practice was standardized across multiple settlements, implying coordination between palaces and subordinate communities. Religious observance provided a framework for reinforcing hierarchical relationships, supporting both elite authority and the administrative functions of the palaces. Palatial systems, strengthened by integrated ritual, economic management, and centralized authority, reached full maturity in the following centuries. Destruction did not end Minoan civilization, it reorganized it. Around 1700 BCE, the first-generation palaces of Crete, including Knossos, Phaistos, and Malia, experienced extensive destruction. Archaeological evidence points primarily to seismic activity rather than human invasion. Excavations reveal collapsed masonry, toppled columns, and widespread burn layers consistent with fires triggered by earthquakes. These catastrophic events were geographically widespread, affecting multiple major centers almost simultaneously. While some settlements experienced partial abandonment, the destruction of the palaces did not signify societal collapse. Instead, it marked a pivotal moment in the evolution of Minoan institutional and architectural sophistication. Following the destruction, the palaces were rapidly reconstructed on a significantly larger and more complex scale. Knossos, for example, was rebuilt with advanced ashlar masonry techniques, incorporating precisely cut stone blocks for structural stability. Walls were reinforced to withstand seismic activity, while new foundations and drainage systems were integrated to mitigate future environmental hazards. Archaeologists have identified the earliest use of light wells in palace construction during this period, allowing natural illumination to penetrate deep interior spaces. These architectural innovations reflect both technical ingenuity and centralized planning capable of coordinating large-scale labor and materials. Storage facilities were extensively reorganized. Large magazines were divided into systematically arranged rooms with standardized pithoi for grain, olive oil, and wine. Evidence of seal impressions and linear A tablets demonstrates administrative continuity from the proto-palatial period. Records indicate ongoing collection, redistribution, and oversight of agricultural surplus, confirming that bureaucratic structures remained operational despite the physical destruction of the palaces. This continuity underscores the resilience of Minoan institutions, as central authorities quickly reasserted control over production and trade networks. The rebuilding phase also coincided with increased political centralization, particularly at Knossos. Excavated floor plans reveal the consolidation of administrative, ceremonial, and storage functions within single complexes. Workshops were systematically integrated into palace layouts, suggesting coordinated craft production under centralized oversight. Evidence from seal stones and accounting tablets indicates the continued specialization of bureaucrats and craftspersons, reflecting an institutional framework capable of managing complex economic, religious, and social activity across the island. Artistic expression flourished alongside architectural renewal. Frescoes dating from this period display dynamic compositions, intricate naturalistic detail, and a standardized use of color and motif across multiple sites. Iconography emphasizes ceremonial life, marine imagery, and religious processions, demonstrating both aesthetic innovation and shared cultural identity. Such artistic developments were facilitated by palace-based patronage and institutional support, reinforcing the role of the palaces as centers not only of governance but also of cultural production. Seismic destruction appears to have prompted a reconsideration of urban and defensive planning. Multi-storied structures were constructed with flexible wooden beams and reinforced floors to absorb shock. Complex drainage systems addressed both water management and structural stability. These design choices illustrate an advanced understanding of engineering principles and a proactive response to environmental vulnerability. The integration of such features across multiple palatial centers suggests shared architectural knowledge and standardized construction practices. Linear A and ceilings provide further evidence for administrative resilience. Despite the physical disruption caused by earthquakes and fires, scribes continued to document inventories, track redistributed goods, and manage trade networks. Excavated archives show uninterrupted sequences of tablets, demonstrating that bureaucratic procedures were maintained even during periods of reconstruction. Seal impressions from this era indicate continuity in authority, as administrative symbols and official markings persisted in design and usage from the previous palatial generation. In summary, the destruction of c. 1700 BCE did not signify decline. Instead, it catalyzed a transformative period of architectural, administrative, and cultural development. Palaces were rebuilt on a larger scale, incorporating technical innovations, centralized storage, and administrative oversight. Artistic production reached new heights, and bureaucratic continuity ensured economic and political stability. The Minoan response to natural catastrophe exemplifies institutional resilience and sets the stage for the neo-palatial peak, during which Crete would reach unprecedented complexity in governance, craft, and cultural expression. Rebuilt palaces became the centers of unprecedented cultural and artistic fluorescence, defining the Neopalatial period as the zenith of Minoan civilization. To its height, Minoan power was expressed through space, movement, and imagery. During the Neopalatial period, roughly 1700 to 1450 BCE, Minoan architecture reached its most sophisticated form. Excavations at Knossos and Phaistos reveal palaces with highly organized, multi-level layouts, including central courts, storage magazines, workshops, and ceremonial spaces. Complex circulation patterns allowed coordinated movement of people and goods, while light wells and ventilation systems indicate careful attention to functional design. These structures were clearly administrative hubs rather than royal residences, serving as centers for economic management, craft production, and ritual activity. Urban settlements developed around these palatial cores, with houses, workshops, and storage facilities exhibiting standardized building techniques. Streets and courtyards were organized to optimize access and supervision, suggesting coordinated urban planning under central authority. The integration of infrastructure for drainage and water management further reflects the technical capabilities of neopalatial architects. Artistic expression was closely linked to architecture and civic space. Frescoes depicting ceremonial processions, bull leaping, marine life, and natural motifs were prominent within palace complexes. These works demonstrate elite patronage and institutional sponsorship, integrating visual culture into daily administrative and ritual life. Motifs reveal the influence of Near Eastern and Egyptian artistic traditions, yet they were adapted into a uniquely Minoan style, reflecting Crete's role as a cosmopolitan intermediary in Mediterranean networks. The combination of monumental architecture, urban planning, and integrated visual culture illustrates the centralization of social, political, and ceremonial authority. Palatial complexes embodied both functional governance and cultural sophistication, reinforcing Minoan identity and projecting the power of centralized administration across the island. Art and architecture were sustained by a sophisticated economic system, supported by centralized resource management and trade networks across the Aegean and beyond. Economic control sustained Minoan political authority. During the Neopalatial period, Minoan palaces oversaw highly organized economic systems. Centralized storage facilities contained agricultural surplus, including grain, olive oil, wine, and textiles, which were carefully cataloged using linear A tablets and ceilings. These records indicate systematic collection, redistribution, and oversight, enabling palace authorities to manage resources efficiently across multiple settlements. Workshops within palace complexes coordinated craft production, from pottery to metalwork, under administrative supervision. Trade networks extended throughout the eastern Mediterranean. Archaeological evidence shows the presence of imported materials, such as copper from Cyprus, tin from Anatolia, and luxury goods from Egypt and the Levant. Minoan pottery, particularly finely painted wares, has been recovered at sites across the Cyclades, mainland Greece, and beyond, confirming Crete's active participation in long-distance exchange. By serving as a maritime intermediary, Crete facilitated the movement of raw materials and finished goods, enhancing both its economic centrality and the authority of palace elites. This system of economic integration reinforced social hierarchy. Control over surplus and access to imported materials allowed palace authorities to maintain elite status, sponsor craft production, and fund ceremonial and architectural projects. The capacity to mobilize labor and resources across the island contributed to political stability and the consolidation of administrative structures. Linear A tablets provide clear documentation of quantities, storage locations, and distribution, demonstrating the sophistication of neopalatial economic management. Through centralized oversight, resource coordination, and maritime trade, the neopalatial palaces established Crete as a dominant economic hub in the Aegean. Economic prosperity underpinned political authority, enabling palatial complexes to function simultaneously as administrative centers, cultural institutions, and nodes of interregional connectivity. Economic success also expanded Crete's external influence, reinforcing the island's position as a central actor within Mediterranean trade networks. Minoan belief was embedded in landscape rather than scripture. Minoan religious practice was decentralized, lacking large, formal temples. Instead, Sacred activity occurred in peak sanctuaries, caves, and palace shrines. Peak sanctuaries, such as those at Juktas and Petsofas, were situated on mountaintops and accessed by steep pathways, suggesting deliberate engagement with the natural environment. Caves served both ritual and practical functions, containing votive deposits of pottery, figurines, and animal remains. Palace shrines integrated ceremonial spaces within administrative centers, linking governance with ritual authority. Archaeological evidence indicates that Minoan religion emphasized fertility, nature, and cyclical renewal. Small clay figurines, often depicting female figures, are prevalent across cave and peak sites, as are miniature animals and offerings of food or ceramics. These objects suggest rituals intended to ensure agricultural productivity, community well-being, and the maintenance of social harmony. Religious activity was embedded in daily life rather than codified in sacred texts, reflecting a practical, communal approach to spiritual concerns. Sacred spaces also reinforced social cohesion. By participating in shared rituals, Minoan communities aligned themselves with collective norms and values. Public ceremonies and palace courts, accompanied by processions, music, or dance, emphasized communal identity while subtly supporting elite oversight. The integration of ritual and governance in palace shrines strengthened both administrative authority and cultural continuity across the island. Through these dispersed and landscape-oriented sacred spaces, Minoan religion structured social organization without centralized dogma. Ritual practice intertwined with both economic and political systems, providing a framework for community cohesion, reinforcing social hierarchies, and shaping patterns of everyday life. Religion permeated daily life and social identity, influencing household practice, economic activity, and civic participation throughout Neopalatial Crete. Power in Minoan Crete was visible, but rarely personalized. Archaeological and artistic evidence suggests that Minoan society was hierarchically organized, though not dominated by overt monarchic imagery. Burial practices reveal differentiation in grave goods, with some tombs containing imported vessels, metal objects, and elaborate ceramics, while others held modest offerings. These differences indicate social stratification based on wealth, occupation, or lineage, rather than a centralized royal lineage. Elite status appears linked to control over palatial production, storage, and trade networks, emphasizing institutional authority over individual rulers. Gender representation in Minoan art is distinctive. Female figures appear prominently in ritual frescoes, votive figurines, and ceremonial depictions such as processions and religious performances. While the precise political or religious authority of women remains debated, their recurrent prominence suggests that female roles, possibly as priestesses or ritual specialists, held considerable cultural and social significance. Male figures appear more frequently in depictions of athletic activity, hunting, and maritime trade, reflecting complementary divisions of labor within the society. Community life emphasized collective participation within hierarchical structures. Public ceremonies, processions, and festival activities, often staged in palace courts or at peak sanctuaries, reinforced communal identity while simultaneously supporting elite oversight. Household organization reflects coordinated domestic labor, including craft production, food preparation, and agricultural management. Craft specialization extended to both palatial workshops and local households, integrating artisans into broader economic and social frameworks. Settlement patterns also illustrate social integration. Villages clustered around palatial centers benefited from centralized administration and shared infrastructure, while smaller communities maintained localized autonomy. Access to resources, ritual participation, and craft production was mediated by these hierarchical networks, creating a balance between communal engagement and elite control. Overall, Minoan society was structured through institutional authority, social differentiation, and culturally embedded gender roles, without emphasizing personalized kingship. Hierarchy was maintained through integrated administrative, ritual, and economic systems rather than through explicit royal iconography, reflecting a complex, cooperative social organization. Daily life was shaped by labor and production systems, linking household economy to palatial administration and sustaining Minoan societal cohesion. Even daily labor was part of a broader administrative network. Archaeological evidence demonstrates that household activities in Minoan Crete were closely integrated into the palatial economy. Excavations of domestic structures reveal areas designated for weaving, pottery production, and food processing. Loom weights, spindle whorls, and baking facilities indicate that families contributed both subsistence and specialized goods to local and regional markets. These domestic workshops provided essential components for palatial distribution networks. Skilled craft production was often coordinated under palace oversight. Workshops attached to palaces or located nearby show evidence of standardized techniques in pottery, metallurgy, and fresco production. Linear tablets and seal impressions confirm the allocation of materials and the tracking of outputs, suggesting that artisans operated within a regulated administrative framework. This system allowed central authorities to monitor resource use, maintain quality control, and integrate craft output into broader economic planning. Food production and processing also reflect integration into centralized structures. Storage pit hoi in households and palaces indicate coordinated collection and distribution of grains, olive oil, and wine. Archaeological analysis of animal remains and plant residues shows diversified subsistence strategies that supported both domestic needs and surplus for palace-controlled trade. The domestic economy, therefore, functioned as a productive unit within a larger hierarchical system, linking local labor to island-wide administration. Through these mechanisms, ordinary household activity was embedded in the political and economic organization of Minoan Crete. Craft specialization, agricultural production, and food processing were not isolated tasks but part of an interconnected system coordinated by palatial authorities. Economic integration positioned Crete as a regional power, enabling the Minoan palaces to sustain administrative control, maritime trade, and cultural influence across the eastern Mediterranean. The sea was Crete's primary political arena. During the Neo-Palatial period, Minoan Crete established extensive maritime networks across the Aegean. Archaeological evidence, including harbor installations at Knossos, Knossos, and Phaistos, demonstrates the scale and sophistication of Minoan seafaring infrastructure. Regular traffic between Crete and islands such as Thera, the Cyclades, and mainland Greece facilitated both the transport of raw materials and the dissemination of finished goods, particularly ceramics and metalwork. Pottery distributions across the Aegean reveal consistent patterns, confirming the existence of sustained trade routes. Minoan ships, though not preserved directly in the archaeological record, are inferred from ship graffiti, depictions in frescoes, and the scale of maritime installations. These vessels enabled Crete to exert economic influence far beyond its shores, even without formal territorial conquest. While the concept of a Minoan thalassocracy remains debated among scholars, the evidence supports a model of maritime economic dominance rather than empire. Trade networks allowed the island to control the movement of commodities, regulate access to resources, and project influence through cultural exchange. Interactions with other Aegean communities also fostered technological and artistic diffusion. Imported materials such as obsidian, copper, and tin were incorporated into local production, while Minoan pottery and iconography spread outward, influencing Cycladic and mainland Aegean styles. Maritime activity reinforced both political centralization and elite authority at the palaces, as control over sea routes ensured access to wealth, prestige goods, and strategic knowledge. Through these networks, Crete maintained a form of soft power, projecting influence across the Aegean without relying on military conquest. The island's dominance was exercised through commerce, cultural transmission, and institutional oversight of maritime logistics. Maritime reach led to cultural diffusion, linking Minoan Crete to a broader Mediterranean exchange system and shaping its artistic and technological identity. Minoan influence traveled through exchange, not armies. Archaeological and textual evidence indicates that Neo-Palatial Crete maintained active cultural and commercial contact with Egypt and the Near East. Egyptian tomb paintings from the 18th dynasty depict Aegean emissaries bearing goods resembling Minoan pottery and textiles, demonstrating recognition of Crete as a significant trading partner. These depictions coincide with archaeological finds of imported Egyptian faience, scarabs, and luxury goods at Minoan palaces, indicating reciprocal exchange. Likewise, near eastern cylinder seals, beads, and metal objects appear on the island, reflecting integration into long-distance trade networks. Artistic motifs further demonstrate the flow of ideas between Crete and external powers. Marine and vegetal imagery prevalent in Minoan frescoes parallels Egyptian naturalistic conventions, while certain metalworking techniques and decorative conventions show Near Eastern influence. Despite these borrowings, Minoan artisans adapted imported styles to local aesthetic standards, creating a distinctive visual vocabulary that remained recognizably Cretan. This synthesis underscores the role of Crete as a cosmopolitan hub capable of mediating and transforming external cultural inputs. Trade and exchange were primarily commercial and diplomatic rather than military. There is no evidence of Minoan conquest in Egypt or the Levant. Influence was exerted through the distribution of goods, shared iconography, and participation in interregional networks. Linear A records indicate palace oversight of luxury goods, while imported materials supported both ritual activity and elite display within palaces. This economic and cultural integration enhanced Minoan prestige, facilitating Crete's status as a central actor in Eastern Mediterranean interaction. These connections also exposed Crete to external pressures, including fluctuations in resource availability, competition with other maritime powers, and the introduction of new technologies and ideas. Palatial authorities responded by maintaining administrative flexibility, centralizing storage and redistribution, and promoting cultural cohesion through standardized artistic and ritual practices. Such networks also exposed Crete to external pressures, setting the stage for strategic adaptation in trade, craft, and governance during the late Neopalatial period. Mainland Greece learned from Crete before it ruled it. During the Neopalatial period, Minoan Crete maintained extensive contact with mainland Greek communities, particularly in the Cyclades, Boeotia, and the Peloponnese. Archaeological evidence demonstrates the early presence of Minoan pottery, fresco styles, and religious motifs on the mainland, reflecting both trade and cultural influence. Imported Minoan ceramics are found in elite tombs and settlement sites, while local artisans adopted Minoan techniques in pottery, metalwork, and fresco decoration, signaling selective emulation of Cretan material culture. Beyond art, administrative models also traveled. Early Mycenaean settlements show evidence of centralized storage facilities and proto-palatial structures inspired by Cretan architectural conventions. Linear A influence is evident in later adaptation into Linear B script, suggesting that record-keeping and bureaucratic practices were learned from Crete and localized over time. These developments indicate that mainland communities initially borrowed Minoan organizational frameworks rather than imposing external control. This process of cultural transmission contributed to the rise of Mycenaean polities, which would later dominate Crete in the Late Bronze Age. By integrating Minoan artistic, religious, and administrative systems, mainland societies laid the foundations for their eventual political and military expansion. Minoan influence, therefore, shaped the trajectory of early Greek civilization prior to the palatial conquest. However, increased engagement with external networks also heightened Crete's vulnerability. Dependence on maritime trade, exposure to foreign ideas, and the movement of people and goods made palatial centers sensitive to environmental, economic, and social pressures. These factors would later contribute to instability during the late Neopalatial period, creating conditions for both internal transformation and eventual Mycenaean ascendancy. External connections increased vulnerability to crisis, linking Minoan prosperity directly to the resilience of its palatial and maritime systems. Natural disaster altered the balance of Minoan stability. Around 1600 BCE, the volcanic eruption of Thera, modern Santorini, produced a cataclysmic environmental event with widespread regional consequences. Geological and tephra studies indicate a massive explosive eruption, generating tsunamis, extensive ashfall, and atmospheric disruption across the Aegean. Coastal settlements on Crete, particularly along the northern shore, likely experienced flooding and damage to port facilities, while ash deposits would have affected agricultural productivity and freshwater sources. Archaeological evidence suggests that the eruption did not immediately destroy palatial centers or depopulate Crete. However, economic and maritime systems were significantly stressed. Harbor installations may have been rendered temporarily inoperable, interrupting trade and the movement of essential commodities such as grain, olive oil, and wine. Ash-laden soil could have reduced crop yields for several growing seasons, placing additional pressure on centralized storage and redistribution managed by the palaces. Linear A records indicate continued administrative activity during this period, implying efforts to mitigate disruption. Cultural responses reflect adaptive resilience. Fresco and ceramic production continues in the aftermath, suggesting that elite patronage and craft organization were maintained. Yet the eruption likely accelerated pre-existing systemic vulnerabilities, including dependence on long-distance trade, concentration of resources in palatial centers, and reliance on maritime networks. These environmental shocks compounded social and economic stresses, creating conditions that would challenge the stability of neo-palatial governance over subsequent decades. Environmental stress compounded internal pressures, interacting with economic, social, and political factors to shape the trajectory of late neo-palatial Crete. Complex systems rarely fail suddenly. Following the environmental stresses of the Thera eruption and related seismic activity, the neo-palatial palaces of Crete show evidence of declining central authority. Archaeological excavations reveal reduced consistency in administrative practices. Linear A tablet production diminishes, ceilings become less standardized, and some magazine complexes show irregular use. Such patterns suggest that centralized economic and bureaucratic control was increasingly difficult to maintain across the island. Concurrently, regional variation in settlement development indicates rising local autonomy and competition. Smaller towns and peripheral centers appear to have asserted greater control over agricultural resources, craft production, and ritual activity. Material culture in these regions, ceramics, frescoes, and architectural styles, becomes more localized, reflecting a fragmentation of previously island-wide conventions. Palaces that survived physical destruction may have struggled to maintain authority over distant settlements, weakening the administrative cohesion that had characterized the neo-palatial period. The combination of environmental disruption and internal decentralization likely contributed to systemic stress within Minoan society. Reduced trade consistency, localized resource disputes, and disruptions to ritual integration would have eroded the stabilizing influence of centralized authority. Archaeological evidence indicates no sudden collapse. Rather, the decline of palatial dominance appears gradual, consistent with long-term stress accumulation rather than catastrophic failure. This phase of fragmentation increased vulnerability to external actors. Declining administrative efficiency, weakened resource management, and inconsistent maritime oversight created openings for foreign intervention. The institutional robustness that had previously defined the palaces was compromised, setting the stage for subsequent Mycenaean influence and eventual political transformation on Crete. Instability invited external intervention, linking internal political stress with the broader Aegean dynamics of the Late Bronze Age. Disruption spread unevenly across the island. During the late Neopalatial period, evidence indicates that Crete experienced significant economic and social stress, though not uniformly across the island. Archaeological surveys reveal that some settlements, particularly peripheral towns and smaller villages, were partially or entirely abandoned. In contrast, core palatial centers such as Knossos continue to operate, albeit with reduced administrative efficiency. This uneven pattern underscores the regional variability of disruption, reflecting differences in local resource access, proximity to trade routes, and resilience of institutional structures. Trade volume also declined in this period. Imports of copper, tin, and luxury goods from the eastern Mediterranean decrease in both frequency and diversity, while Minoan ceramic exports show irregular distribution across the Cyclades and mainland Greece. Harbor facilities exhibit signs of partial neglect, and storage magazines in certain palaces appear underutilized or inconsistently organized. Linear A records become sporadic, indicating a reduction in bureaucratic oversight and the complexity of economic administration. These trends suggest that centralized redistribution, which had previously underpinned the island's prosperity, was increasingly compromised. Social structures similarly show signs of strain. Craft production became more localized, with workshops in smaller communities producing goods for immediate regional consumption rather than for centralized palatial redistribution. Votive and ritual evidence indicates a decline in coordinated island-wide ceremonial activity, suggesting that shared religious and cultural networks were weakening. Household economies may have reverted to more autonomous production, reflecting a pragmatic adaptation to decreased palace coordination. The cumulative effect of these economic and social pressures left Crete more vulnerable to external forces. As palatial authority weakened and trade networks fragmented, the island's regional influence diminished. Mainland powers, notably the emerging Mycenaean polities, were positioned to exploit this power vacuum. These developments set the stage for the eventual integration of Cretan palaces into broader Aegean political structures, marking the end of fully autonomous Minoan dominance. Mainland powers soon filled the vacuum, linking internal disruption to the broader transformation of Crete during the Late Bronze Age. Power shifted without erasing the palatial model. By approximately 1450 BCE, Knossos, the largest of the Cretan palaces, came under the control of Mycenaean elites. Archaeological and textual evidence indicates that this transition occurred without widespread physical destruction, suggesting a political takeover rather than a violent conquest. Excavations show continued use of the palace's architectural infrastructure, including storage magazines, workshops, and administrative quarters. The continuity of building use demonstrates that the Minoan palatial model remained highly functional and adaptable, even under foreign administration. Linear B tablets, first attested at Knossos during this period, provide clear evidence of Greek-speaking administrators replacing Minoan bureaucrats. These tablets record inventories, commodity distributions, and labor organization in a script adapted from Linear A but phonetically representing early Greek. Administrative activities, such as tracking grain, olive oil, and textile production, continued largely as before, indicating that Mycenaean authorities repurposed existing bureaucratic frameworks rather than dismantling them. Seal impressions and storage arrangements show continuity in institutional oversight, emphasizing the resilience of the palace-centered economic system. Artistic and ritual practices also demonstrate both continuity and adaptation. Frescoes and ceremonial spaces remain in use, though some iconography begins to reflect mainland Greek influence. Religious rituals, particularly those associated with peak sanctuaries and palace shrines, persisted alongside newly introduced Mycenaean symbols. Craft production and trade networks continued to operate under palatial supervision, highlighting the pragmatic integration of local and foreign practices. This period illustrates a complex process of political transformation in which external elites absorbed Minoan administrative, architectural, and economic systems. Rather than erasing local institutions, the Mycenaeans adapted them to serve Greek-speaking authorities, preserving centralized governance while asserting new political control. The takeover of Knossos thus represents both continuity in structure and change in leadership, providing a model for understanding cross-cultural integration in late Bronze Age societies. Administrative systems were repurposed to serve Mycenaean governance, linking economic management, ritual activity, and trade under new political authority. Conquest did not mean cultural replacement. Following the Mycenaean takeover of Knossos around 1450 BCE, Minoan Crete entered a phase of cultural hybridization. Architectural layouts, palatial storage facilities, and administrative structures continued in use, demonstrating that the Minoan model of centralized governance remained functional under new rulers. Frescoes, ceramic styles, and ritual spaces persisted largely in traditional forms, even as subtle Mycenaean stylistic elements, such as new motifs, figurative conventions, and symbols, were incorporated. This period represents a deliberate integration of local Cretan practices with foreign administrative and artistic norms. The palaces continued to serve as centers for economic coordination. Linear B tablets recording commodity distribution, labor assignments, and craft production illustrate the adaptation of existing Minoan bureaucratic mechanisms to Mycenaean oversight. Ceilings and magazine inventories show that control over agricultural and craft production remained centralized, although the linguistic and political context had shifted. This combination of old structures with new leadership reflects a pragmatic approach, allowing the Mycenaeans to consolidate power while maintaining the efficiency of inherited systems. Religious and ceremonial practices also reveal continuity and adaptation. Palace shrines and peak sanctuary traditions persisted, with offerings and figurines following long-established Minoan forms. At the same time, Mycenaean symbols began appearing alongside traditional motifs, particularly in administrative contexts and elite iconography. These blended practices indicate that cultural authority was negotiated rather than imposed, allowing local populations to maintain familiar ritual frameworks even under foreign political control. This hybrid phase lasted several generations, demonstrating the resilience and flexibility of Minoan social, economic, and cultural structures. While political authority had shifted, the underlying systems of production, craft, and ritual remained largely intact. The interaction between Minoan traditions and Mycenaean oversight exemplifies how conquest could coexist with cultural preservation, producing a distinctive phase of syncretism that characterizes late Minoan Crete. Hybrid systems eventually declined, as external pressures, internal disruptions, and changing Aegean dynamics contributed to the final collapse of palatial authority on Crete. The last palace marked the end of an era. Archaeological evidence indicates that Knossos, the central palatial complex of Crete, was destroyed around 1375 BCE. Excavations reveal extensive burning, structural collapse, and widespread debris, marking the final cessation of palatial activity. The precise cause of this destruction remains debated among scholars. Some propose internal social unrest or palace revolt, while others suggest mainland Mycenaean military intervention or a combination of political and economic stressors. Regardless of the exact catalyst, the event conclusively terminated centralized palatial administration on the island. Linear B records, which document administrative and economic activity under Mycenaean oversight, cease entirely following this period. Sealings, inventories, and tablet production abruptly stop, demonstrating that the bureaucratic framework that had structured Cretan governance for centuries no longer functioned. Workshops, storage facilities, and ceremonial spaces were abandoned, and palatial authority was not re-established, signaling a permanent structural collapse rather than temporary disruption. Material culture reflects this transition. Pottery production becomes localized, with diminished standardization and reduced complexity, while frescoes and decorative motifs decline in both quantity and scale. Settlement patterns also change. Smaller sites persist, but the dense urban and palatial organization characteristic of Neo-Palatial and late Minoan Crete largely disappears. These archaeological signals indicate that social, economic, and political cohesion had disintegrated, marking the end of Minoan dominance in the Aegean. Despite the destruction, elements of Minoan culture continued to influence the region. Mycenaean polities on the mainland incorporated aspects of Cretan artistic, religious, and administrative practices, preserving Minoan contributions indirectly. These cultural residues testify to the enduring significance of Crete's palatial civilization, even after its institutional collapse. Minoan civilization entered its final phase, transitioning from palace-centered administration to dispersed, locally organized communities while leaving a lasting imprint on subsequent Aegean societies. Collapse was institutional, not demographic. Following the destruction of the palaces around 1375 BCE, Crete transitioned into a post-palatial phase characterized by smaller, more autonomous communities. Archaeological surveys indicate that settlements persisted across both coastal and inland regions, albeit with reduced population density and simpler urban organization. Palatial architecture was abandoned, and the administrative systems that had managed economic redistribution and craft production ceased entirely. Yet the island remained populated, demonstrating that societal collapse was structural rather than demographic. Material culture in post-palatial Crete shows both continuity and simplification. Pottery production continued, though forms became standardized and less elaborate than those of the Neo-Palatial and late Minoan periods. Frescoes and decorative arts declined in scale and complexity, but certain motifs, marine imagery, floral patterns, and symbolic iconography, persisted, reflecting enduring aesthetic traditions. Craft production, including metallurgy, weaving, and stonework, was largely localized, integrated into household economies rather than centralized workshops, but remained active and functional. Religious practices adapted to the loss of palace shrines. Peak sanctuaries and caves continued to serve as ritual spaces, and votive offerings indicate that fertility and nature-based cults persisted. While ceremonial coordination on an island-wide scale diminished, local communities maintained spiritual continuity, preserving social cohesion and cultural memory. The post-palatial period also facilitated the diffusion of Minoan culture to neighboring regions. Mycenaean Greece, in particular, absorbed artistic, administrative, and religious elements from Crete, creating a hybridized cultural environment on the mainland. This process illustrates that the end of palatial authority did not erase Minoan influence. Rather, it redistributed cultural and technological knowledge beyond the island. Overall, post-palatial Crete reflects a society adapting to institutional collapse. Palatial administration ended, but daily life, craft production, religious practice, and cultural traditions persisted, demonstrating resilience. Communities reorganized around local needs and resources, preserving key aspects of Minoan identity while adjusting to a fundamentally transformed political landscape. Cultural elements endured, allowing Minoan contributions to persist within the broader Aegean world and shaping the development of subsequent Bronze Age civilizations. Cultural memory outlived political power. Even after the collapse of the palaces, Minoan Crete continued to exert influence through the survival of its religious, artistic, and technological traditions. Archaeological evidence demonstrates that many religious practices persisted at the local level. Peak sanctuaries, cave shrines, and domestic ritual spaces continued to function as focal points for fertility and nature-based cults. Votive figurines, offering deposits, and ritual implements exhibit continuity in form and symbolism, reflecting the endurance of long-established spiritual frameworks despite the absence of centralized ceremonial coordination. Artistic motifs also survived, adapting to post-palatial contexts and informing broader Aegean culture. Marine imagery, floral designs, and symbolic representations found in frescoes and pottery continued to appear in later Greek art, particularly during the Mycenaean period. Linear B records indicate the continued use of palatial workshops for craft production, demonstrating that technical skills, such as pottery manufacture, metallurgy, and textile weaving, remained integral to both local economies and external trade networks. These elements reveal the persistence of Minoan aesthetic and material traditions beyond the political collapse of the palaces. Minoan influence extended beyond Crete through interaction with mainland Greece and the wider eastern Mediterranean. Mycenaean elites incorporated Minoan iconography, architectural features, and religious motifs into their own palatial centers, effectively creating hybridized cultural expressions. These adaptations underscore the selective transmission of Minoan practices, preserving functional and symbolic aspects while integrating them into new political and linguistic frameworks. Even centuries after the decline of palatial administration, Minoan artistic and religious legacies remained embedded within the broader Bronze Age cultural landscape. This continuity demonstrates that the end of political power did not equate to the disappearance of cultural identity. Minoan traditions provided a foundation for subsequent Aegean civilizations, influencing art, religion, and administrative techniques. The transmission of these elements illustrates how cultural systems can persist through adaptation, reinterpretation, and regional exchange. Legacy extended beyond Crete, shaping Mycenaean Greece and contributing to the enduring historical significance of Minoan civilization in the Aegean Bronze Age. Archaeology reveals process, not catastrophe. The post-palatial trajectory of Minoan Crete is clearly visible through settlement patterns, artifact distribution, and material culture. Excavations across the island indicate that the decline of centralized palatial authority occurred gradually rather than as the result of a single catastrophic event. Peripheral towns and rural settlements persisted, albeit in modified forms, reflecting continuity in habitation and local economic activity. Conversely, urbanized palatial centers were abandoned, leaving behind architectural remains, storage complexes, and workshop structures that document the cessation of administrative functions. Artifact assemblages further illustrate the uneven nature of decline. Pottery from the post-palatial period shows a simplification in form and decoration, reflecting a reduction in centralized craft coordination. Frescoes and decorative objects, while present, are less standardized and occur primarily in smaller domestic or communal contexts. Luxury items previously controlled by the palaces are rarely recovered, suggesting a decentralization of elite consumption and trade networks. Linear A and B administrative records cease entirely, reinforcing the loss of organized, island-wide bureaucracy. Settlement surveys indicate regional variation in continuity. Northern coastal sites such as Knossos and Heraklion retain material traces longer than some inland or southern settlements, suggesting differential resilience based on geography, access to resources, and proximity to maritime routes. Archaeologists interpret these patterns as evidence for adaptive local governance and household economies replacing centralized authority, rather than wholesale demographic collapse. Overall, the archaeological record supports a gradualist model of decline. The process involved structural simplification, administrative cessation, and economic decentralization, while simultaneously preserving aspects of daily life, craft production, and ritual practice. These findings counter earlier narratives of abrupt catastrophe and emphasize the ability of Cretan communities to adapt to institutional stress and environmental challenges. Modern interpretation reshaped understanding, demonstrating that Minoan civilization's end was a protracted transformation rather than an instantaneous fall, leaving enduring legacies for the broader Aegean world. Myth preserved fragments of historical reality. Long after the collapse of the Minoan palaces, later Greek traditions retained faint and often distorted memories of Crete's political and cultural prominence. Classical sources, including Homer, Hesiod, and later historians, reference King Minos, the labyrinthine palace, and ritualized practices that bear a tenuous connection to Minoan society. These narratives likely reflect oral traditions transmitted over centuries, preserving awareness of Crete as a sophisticated and organized center of power, though details were mythologized to suit emerging Greek cultural frameworks. Mythic motifs, such as the labyrinth, the Minotaur, and sacrificial rites, suggest an attempt to interpret or memorialize complex social, religious, and architectural systems of Bronze Age Crete. The labyrinth, for example, may symbolize the intricate layout of Knossos and other palaces, whose corridors, storage areas, and ceremonial spaces were unparalleled in complexity for their time. Similarly, references to Minos as a judge or maritime authority hint at the historical influence Crete exerted over Aegean trade networks and island politics during the Neopalatial and late Minoan periods. While these literary sources cannot be taken as factual accounts, they indicate that the memory of Minoan civilization endured in the Greek cultural consciousness. Ancient Greeks recognized the existence of a pre-Hellenic Cretan civilization with centralized authority, advanced craftsmanship, and distinctive religious practices, even if the specifics were reshaped into allegorical or moralized forms. Modern archaeology has clarified and refined this picture. Excavations, material analyses, and epigraphic studies have recovered palatial architecture, linear A and B records, frescoes, and ritual artifacts that demonstrate Minoan sophistication in administration, economy, and culture. These findings separate historical reality from literary embellishment, showing that Greek myth preserved kernels of historical truth without fully documenting political, social, or economic complexity. Modern archaeology reframed Minoan history, allowing scholars to reconstruct Crete's Bronze Age civilization with evidence-based precision, distinguishing tangible achievements from later mythic reinterpretation. Modern understanding evolved through debate. The rediscovery of Minoan Crete in the early 20th century fundamentally shaped perceptions of Aegean prehistory. Excavations led by Sir Arthur Evans at Knossos between 1900 and 1935 introduced the term Minoan and revealed extensive palatial complexes, frescoes, and administrative records. Evans' work emphasized palace-centered authority, centralized economic control, and artistic sophistication, constructing a narrative of a unified, highly advanced civilization. His reconstructions, including restored frescoes and architectural elements, profoundly influenced public and scholarly understanding but reflected interpretive choices that sometimes blurred the line between evidence and speculation. Subsequent generations of archaeologists have refined and revised Evans' interpretations through more rigorous scientific methods. Stratigraphic analysis, Radiocarbon dating and systematic survey work have clarified chronological sequences, settlement patterns, and regional variation. Excavations at sites beyond Knossos, such as Phaistos, Malia, and Zakros, have demonstrated that Minoan society was not monolithic, but rather a complex network of palatial and non-palatial communities exhibiting diverse administrative, artistic, and ritual practices. Linear A and B studies, alongside chemical and isotopic analyses of artifacts and human remains, have provided further insight into trade, diet, and social organization. Modern scholarship emphasizes a balanced, evidence-driven approach. Interpretations now account for natural disasters, regional differences, and economic and political stressors, moving beyond the early model of an idealized palace-centered utopia. Debates regarding Minoan thalassocracy, gender roles, and social hierarchy have been informed by both material evidence and comparative studies of contemporary Aegean cultures, fostering a nuanced understanding of Bronze Age Crete. These historiographical developments highlight the evolution of knowledge over time. Evans' pioneering work established a foundation for Minoan studies, but ongoing research and methodological rigor have corrected and expanded that foundation, demonstrating the importance of critical analysis and interdisciplinary evidence. Assessment requires balanced synthesis, integrating archaeological, textual, and environmental data to understand Minoan civilization's achievements, limitations, and enduring impact on the Aegean Bronze Age. The Minoans shaped history without empire. Minoan Crete represents the earliest complex civilization in Europe, demonstrating advanced administrative, artistic, and economic systems long before the rise of Mycenaean Greece or classical city-states. Archaeological evidence shows that centralized palaces coordinated surplus production, craft specialization, and long-distance trade, facilitating economic integration across the island and into the wider Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean. Linear A and later Linear B tablets, along with sealings and standardized storage practices, indicate sophisticated record-keeping and bureaucratic capacity. These administrative innovations provided a model for subsequent Bronze Age polities in Greece. Artistic production further underscores Minoan influence. Frescoes, pottery, metalwork, and sculptural forms exhibit both technical mastery and symbolic complexity. Motifs derived from natural landscapes, marine life, and ritual activity informed Mycenaean iconography, demonstrating that aesthetic traditions persisted beyond the palace's destruction. The integration of art into everyday and ceremonial spaces illustrates how cultural expression reinforced social organization and elite authority, establishing a precedent for linking visual culture to political and economic structures. Trade and maritime activity positioned Crete as a central node in Aegean exchange networks. Minoan vessels carried pottery, metals, and luxury goods to Egypt, the Levant, and Cycladic islands, facilitating both economic and cultural interaction. These networks strengthened Crete's strategic importance and provided a template for maritime connectivity that influenced subsequent Greek and Mediterranean civilizations. Importantly, the Minoans achieved historical impact without territorial empire. Their influence was exercised through economic integration, cultural dissemination, and administrative innovation rather than military conquest. This model of indirect power highlights the role of complex social, religious, and economic systems in shaping regional development, demonstrating that political authority need not always be coercive to be historically significant. Overall, Minoan civilization provides a foundation for understanding the evolution of complex societies in Europe and the Eastern Mediterranean. Through administration, art, trade, and cultural continuity, the Minoans contributed to the development of later Aegean societies, leaving an enduring imprint on Bronze Age history. By the conclusion of the Late Bronze Age, the achievements and systems developed on Crete had shaped the trajectory of the Aegean, preserving the Minoans' legacy in both material culture and historical memory. Before you leave, consider subscribing to Nightfall History for more immersive explorations of the ancient world. Click the bell icon to be notified of our daily documentaries, and share your thoughts in the comments. What aspect of Minoan civilization intrigued you the most? Your engagement helps us continue to bring history to life with precision and clarity.